first, I would like to give floor to Dan, or Screen to be more precise, and Dan can share his thoughts on the current developments and how we should expect things to turn out in the short run and in the long run. So please, Dan, floor is, or Screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much. What I'm going to do is put a presentation up on the screen and discuss and sort of just follow through a couple of slides on this issue. And I'm just really going to talk about three issues, one after the other, assuming I can figure out how to advance the slide, and I did. First, the economic damage, which is, of course, very severe and is, I think, going to last, unfortunately, a long time. Then I want to specifically touch on perhaps, I guess we would call it the fiscal element of this. Will there be a second fiscal crisis, especially in some European nations? And then I want to close up with a few thoughts on the cost-benefit analysis that we're currently going through in many American states, which is whether to reopen the economy, how to reopen the economy, and how to weigh the trade-offs on these issues. And I'll start with the economic outlook. And I'll admit right up front, I have no idea how deep the downturn will be. But there's no question we're going to be somewhere far greater in terms of at least short-run damage than the financial crisis, the Great Recession, whatever you want to call what we went through a little bit over 10 years ago. But the real issue, the real challenge is trying to figure out what happens as the coronavirus is, well, hopefully cured, but whether it's a vaccine, whether it's more effective treatment, or whether it's simply the fact that you can't keep economies shut down forever without really catastrophic consequences. How will the economy rebound? What will we see? I don't think it'll be a V-shaped recovery. I desperately hope that's the case. That's obviously the best scenario for improving people's lives, for restoring income, for improving public finances. But unless we have a very quick development of a vaccine, or unless we have some really silver bullet type treatment regimen that's developed, I fear that we're going to have a very lengthy economic bout of economic suffering from this, because even if governments reopen their economies, a lot of businesses are not going to go back to normal. A lot of people are simply going to be afraid and they're not going to go out and work. They're not going to go out and shop. So I think the most likely realistic, albeit pessimistic, assumption that we have is that there's a long period of economic stagnation in front of us. And even when people begin to go out into the economy, you're going to see secondary bouts of the coronavirus, and that's going to cause sort of this start and stop system, again, barring something really dramatic and positive in terms of healthcare, treatment, vaccines, something like that. So I fear that there's a deep and permanent loss of prosperity that we're going to suffer. And then one of the consequences of this economic suffering is that public finances are really taking a terrible toll. Now, I'm obviously more familiar with the numbers in the United States. We're talking about trillions of dollars of additional outlays, deficits approaching the level that we haven't seen since World War II. Now, given the pandemic, I'm not arguing with the notion that some of these actions are necessary. However, we are going to deal with a situation where at some point, people, depending on the country that they're in, are going to say, I don't really trust that this government will pay me back if I lend it money. That's really what defines a fiscal crisis. There's not some magic point where you reach 90% of debt to GDP, which has been in the academic literature as potentially a tipping point. I don't think that's really the case. It all depends on the specific government and what we're dealing with. And since we're dealing with something really horrific with this pandemic, where we're going to see budget deficits explode, both because of the coronavirus related spending, but also the economic shutdown, is leading to a collapse in tax revenue. There are even estimates in the US that tax revenue could fall below 10% of GDP. Now, I've always wanted to get to a situation where tax revenue was that small, but I didn't want to get there in this way for this reason. And certainly I wanted it because of small government, not because of an economic downturn. Now, I'm going to show you a slide of different countries and their debt to GDP ratio before the coronavirus. But keep in mind that we don't know who's going to be hit by a financial crisis because we don't know what the sentiment of investors is going to be. And perhaps most importantly, we have no idea what the European Central Bank might be doing. But I'll simply put this chart up on the screen, showing on the left side, you have some countries like Switzerland, Australia, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Apologies for the primitive internet that I must have here. Let me go ahead and go back to my presentation. I was talking about the potential for some sort of a bailout by the European Central Bank. That's questionable. I don't know whether that will happen. We, of course, have the same issue in the United States, whether the federal government should borrow additional money to bail out various state governments. That's an open question right now. Let me go ahead and wrap up my presentation, though, by touching on this issue of cost-benefit analysis. And I could hear when I got back online that Ivan Miklos was talking about some of these issues as well. The original goal, of course, was to flatten the curve, to make sure that healthcare systems weren't overwhelmed with serious cases. It seems most countries have succeeded with that, but the goalposts have now been moved where politicians and also people are saying, well, we're just scared. We don't want to do anything. But then, of course, that gets into a whole separate issue, which is what are the health consequences of an economic shutdown? What are the health consequences of lower GDP? And there is in the academic literature a very well-established relationship that the richer a society is, the healthier a society is, the higher the longevity of the population is. So if we keep economies shut down, we'll have fewer deaths from coronavirus, we'll have less risk of secondary outbreaks of infection from coronavirus, but we're going to have long-term consequences in terms of diminished health outcomes and diminished longevity because of the coronavirus. And this is something that's very well established. I'm showing here a page from a joint study from the American Enterprise Institute, which is center-right, and the Brookings Institution, which is center-left. And the very right part of the screen, which I don't expect anybody to be able to read, it simply measures the net lives saved by different regulations. And if we then blow up part of the screen, you'll see that there are many regulations that the government has done in the United States that ostensibly are designed to improve public safety, but it turns out the economic damage from those regulations was so harsh that these experts from, again, center-right and center-left working together, they estimated that these regulations actually reduced lives in the long run. And my concern is that we're dealing with something similar with the coronavirus, where if we try to keep economies shut down forever, again, barring some sort of great news on vaccines or treatment, in effect, this Venn diagram is the choice that we're sort of going to be facing. Yes, we should worry about the deaths and the harm of coronavirus, but I'm very concerned about that bottom circle, which is the economic damage, especially because that economic damage in the long run also has very negative health consequences. So what are we looking at now, especially for a think tank person like myself? I wonder whether we're going to have a permanent expansion of the burden of government. Will there be a bigger welfare state? Will there be more trade barriers? Will there be higher tax rates? We have plenty of politicians in the United States that are talking about using this crisis as an excuse to raise tax burdens, to expand the cost and size of government. And of course, I think the fundamental choice that all nations are going to have is that if you make the wrong decisions about not a temporary expansion of government, which is happening all over the world and is understandable, But the real issue in my mind as a public finance economist is what's going to happen in the future. And I'm very concerned that the current ethos among the political class is that they're going to use this virus as an excuse to impose policies that otherwise people hopefully would have realized are not very wise for a country. And so with that, again, I apologize for my internet troubles earlier, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations.